Welcome everyone to the Q&A session with Susan Cain. Susan, thank you so much for the talk. That was brilliant. Gave us a lot of insight. And now we have quite a few questions for you. So see if we can delve a bit deeper into the idea of introversion and extroversion. And I mean, you really hit a nerve. You have a TED Talk that's been viewed, I think, tens of millions of times. The book has sold really well. I thought we could start with you mentioned a little bit, but some of the fallacies that people make about what's an introvert, what's an extrovert, as if you could just see it on somebody. What are
Yeah.
some of the typical ones that you've heard?
Well, I would say the two biggest ones that I hear, number one is the idea that an introvert is somebody that it's kind of like a synonym for a misanthrope. It's somebody who just doesn't like people, someone who you can't trust. And this is such a misconception. We actually know this from psychological research that introversion and extroversion have nothing to do with how warm you are, how loving you are, anything like that. It has to do with how do you like to spend your social time. So you can have two kind of equally social people. One's an introvert, one's an extrovert. The introvert would rather interact with you by having a one-on-one conversation, or going out for a quiet glass of wine, or a beer or whatever. And the extrovert might rather interact with people they don't know because that's more stimulating, or going to a party where they've got their friends, but they've got lots of other people around too. Like the difference really has to do with how much stimulation are you craving, not how much social life are you craving. So that's the first thing. And then the second misconception, and I alluded to this in the talk, is the idea that an introvert cannot be a good leader. This is a widely held conception, and we have so much data showing that this isn't the case. I'll just tell you one quick thing.
Yep.
So the consultant Jim Collins, who wrote a book called Good to Great, did a study of the top 11 best performing companies in the US at the time. And he found that every single one of those companies, every single one, was led by a CEO who was described by peers as quiet, unassuming, soft-spoken, shy. So this constellation of traits that we think of as not really being associated with leadership. And if you've been studying this as long as I have been, this is actually not surprising, because what we know about introverts is they tend to get really very passionate about one or two areas in their lives. And so if you have somebody in your workplace who is really talented and passionate about what they're doing, they will end up building expertise, building networks, inspiring trust in people, and they can ascend to leadership positions through a channel that's different from the one that you might expect for kind of the natural leaders. And we see this time and time again.
Yeah, I think we're going to come back to some leadership questions as well. But there's something happening right now across the world that sort of we're all taking part in. Unfortunately, that's COVID-19.
Yep.
And there's some new research that indicates that maybe some of the classic stereotypes that, if you're an introvert, you love this. You'd be on your home office. You don't have to talk to anybody. But you shared some interesting things about that with me earlier. So could you speak to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's funny when those memes started to come around that, this is introvert nirvana. I was skeptical from the beginning, partly from my own personal experience, because I am an introvert and I was really missing, along with everybody else, so many of the kind of cherished routines of my life that I couldn't do anymore. And I knew that it was just more complicated than that. And sure enough, we were talking about this recently. There's a new study that came out in the Frontiers of Psychology, actually finding that for some introverts, the quarantine and the disruptions are more difficult than they are for extroverts. And the reason for this is that introverts in general tend to experience things more intensely, for good and for bad. So if you experience things intensely, it also means that, the next time you see a beautiful sunset, you really, really like love watching that sunset. But it also means that if you're bummed about quarantine, you're going to feel that intensely too. And so that's something that's just useful to know. What I've come to believe is that the real way to think about how COVID is working for people is based on how well were their lives aligned with their personality before COVID came. And I'm thinking of a friend of mine who runs a major organization, and he's an introvert.
Mm-hmm.
And he has been delighted by COVID, in all the stereotypical ways. Like he says, this is amazing. I don't have to go to the office. I just have much more time to myself. And so what that is saying to me is that his life before COVID was actually not right for him. Like he was out of alignment, and now he's okay. Whereas I know other people who are extroverts who are thrilled with COVID, because even for them, even though they were extroverts, their lives were too much. So really it has to depend. I think we should all use COVID as a way for deeper self-reflection, and like, were we in the right place before? Where are we now? And more to the point, where should we go when this pandemic is hopefully over soon?
Yeah, figure out our alignment.
Yeah.
So, but that's important also, knowing that some introverts struggle more. So what should leaders do to follow up colleagues, and what should colleagues do as well to I suppose be there, since loneliness and depression and potential even anxiety can be a bigger part of life for someone who's an introvert?
Well, I mean, in general, it's a theme that we keep hitting, that introverts would tend, they're probably not going to want to open up on a big Zoom call with, like one of those gallery views with 17 people on the call. That's not going to happen. So you're much better off connecting in as personal a way as you can. Now, of course, this depends on how well do you know the person, but also to know that in general, introverts tend to want to connect around shared interests, or around some substantive topic of interest. They're not going to be as interested in connecting through, I don't know if schmoozing is a word that you guys would use they're not going to be as interested in alleviating their loneliness through just like chatting about whatever. They'd rather talk about something substantive. So that also is really useful to know.
Yeah, have something to talk about, something real.
Yeah, something real, and not to 17 people at once, but in a kind of quieter and more deeply connected way.
Yeah, and hopefully though, there will be a time after this, some world after COVID. We'll be back at the offices. We might be doing more working from home, some at the office. How should we think about work patterns, and how should we design our work now after COVID to get the best out of both introverts, extroverts, and all of us in between?
Well, I think we have a real opportunity now to rethink the places where we were not designed optimally beforehand. And so if we're talking about like office architecture, for example, like long before COVID ever came around, I've actually been a big opponent of the trend towards radically open workplaces. And there was like a big mountain of data that existed pre-COVID showing the problems with these kinds of workspaces. Everything from people not really being able to concentrate when they know they can be interrupted, to kind of emotional discomfort at just being on view all the time. And then, and this third one is really interesting from a COVID point of view. There was data showing that people got sick more frequently in an open office plan because you're just exposed to everybody around you. And in an age where we know what that now means, I think this is really an opportunity to rethink some of the excesses of open plan offices. And this doesn't necessarily mean, it could, but it doesn't necessarily mean going back to the old system of everybody being sequestered within their own four walls. There are hybrid models too, where you can build office spaces where everybody can, where there's enough freedom and enough variety that each individual can move freely back and forth between social spaces and individual spaces as they wish. And it's actually useful to know for all of us, whether we're extroverts or introverts, our craving for stimulation fluctuates throughout the day. So if you start paying attention to this in yourself, you're going to notice that you have your moments where you want to be around other people, and then you have your moments where you're craving privacy and quiet. And so if we can build workplaces where people can become attuned to those needs and meet them, that's not coddling. That's like really good for productivity.
Yeah, exactly, right. So if there's certain things that, or there's certain things that leaders should focus on in this work as you sort of gather the troops back at the office, if you still have an office then.
Yeah. So for leaders, I mean, I think we all need to be thinking team by team by team. Who are the individuals in this team, and where are they temperamentally? Do I have a team that skews more introverted or more extroverted? I hope that you have a team that's a real mix of the two, because that's where the magic does tend to happen, because these two types really are so complementary. But then you really want to make sure that everybody in their team is working in an optimal way, and that people are accommodating each other. So I would encourage you to use the personality test that's on my site. It's there for you. And use that as a way to jumpstart the discussion of who each individual member of the team is and what do you each need. So for example, you might find that an extroverted member of your team might crave getting feedback throughout the day, or everybody touching base with each other throughout the day to see what's happening. And you might find that an introverted member of the team is craving the ability to have 3 hours a day where they can sit and get into a state of deep flow and know they're not going to get pulled into a meeting. And once you know that about these individuals who respect each other, you can together craft a team system that works for both of you, where the extrovert's getting the feedback, the introvert's getting the uninterrupted deep flow, everybody's happy. But it doesn't happen unless you create the environment where people can talk about this stuff.
So that means basically sitting down, discussing, okay, this is me as an introvert, this is me as an extrovert.
Yeah.
Here's what I need. So you kind of have to go a little bit deep, I suppose.
You have to go a little bit deep, yeah. And you have to create an environment where everybody's comfortable and there's no value attached one way or to being one way or another. It just is. And the question is, how are we all going to be at our best? Because why wouldn't we want to be?
Exactly. And you mentioned in the talk that there's research to show that introverted leaders are at least as good or even better than extroverted leaders. So how should we approach succession knowing this, since often many of the extroverted sort of traits, things that we think of extroverted, is also connected to leadership.
Yeah. So I mean, we need to make sure that the contributions that introverts make are noticed in the first place. And I mean, so for individual introverts, what they can do is figure out ways to share their knowledge in a way that doesn't feel like uncomfortable self-promotion, which is what I hear again and again is the stumbling block. So think of it not as self-promotion, but think of it instead as sharing knowledge. And that might be like, I don't know, writing a blog post in which you share your expertise. It might be, and now I'm getting back to what I said before about becoming comfortable with public speaking. There was something about standing up in front of a group of your peers that is disproportionately powerful. Like you could be, toiling for a year over there with nobody seeing you, versus giving a speech for 5 minutes over here, and the 5 minute speech might have more of an impact on your ability to ascend to leadership roles than anything else you ever do. Doesn't really make sense, or is it fair? I don't know, but it is. So
Part of
that's,
it is playing by the rules,
yeah, I mean, it's just like,
but also just maybe understanding what does really good leadership look like, and it might not just look like the person talking the most.
yeah. And so that's another thing, like, in terms, I think we need to really do a deep think about what criteria are we looking for when we look for this company's next leaders, and really, and kind of do a hard look at ourselves and say, well, are we mostly looking for, kind of the obvious charisma, or are we looking for somebody who really has a vision of where to take this company, and somebody who's really good at making the people around them comfortable and working at their best? And very often quiet leaders do that incredibly effectively.
Yeah, I was thinking that leaders, one of the most important things you do is making decisions. Are there
Yep.
differences to how you make decisions as an introvert or as an extrovert?
Yes.
Looking at.
Yeah. There are actually quite interesting differences between the two as a group. So in general, extroverts, I don't know in Norway if you have these two expressions. You can tell me if you do. Seize the day would be one of them.
Yeah, seize the day, grip dagen. Yeah,
Yeah. And then another would be look before you leap. Um,
yeah, it makes sense in Norwegian. Yeah.
okay.
Se for
Yeah.
håpet.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I mean, you don't want to be too stereotyped about it, but in general, extroverts tend more towards seize the day in decision making. Introverts tend more towards look before you leap. And there are so many different studies documenting this, and they each have their advantages, right? So, like, an extrovert is going to identify a new opportunity and really go for it, but they are going to tend not to see the potential problems as readily as an introvert will. There are actually brain reasons for this. The reward networks in our brain that all of us have that become activated at the prospect of something good happening. Reward networks are stronger in extroverts. So if you're an extrovert who's thinking about a new business deal, like, your reward networks are going crazy. And you're so excited. So you're not going to notice other things that are happening. And you actually really want to make sure you've got an introvert in the room at that point who might be able to temper you. And introverts, it's kind of like, the opposite set of strengths and disadvantages. Introverts tend to approach decision making in a careful and thoughtful manner, which has a way of getting you to make really good decisions. And sometimes it can be too slow. So they're actually quite different.
Yeah, but that's quite interesting if you connect that to what you were talking about with Jim Collins' research and the leaders there. That maybe there's a connection there, that if you take it just a little bit slow, and of course probably listen to a few extroverts as well, but maybe that's a good way forward.
Yeah. There was a study actually of it was an investment bank in London that found that the most effective or successful traders tended to be introverts. So it's not that introverts won't make the decision, like, they do make the trade, but they tend to go more slowly.
So you talked a little bit about this, how to sort of, I hate to say survive as an introvert, because it makes it sound like it's a bunch of people that really struggle, because it's a spectrum and people are all over the spectrum. But if you are in a career where it's sort of very focused on the classic extroverted traits, what should you do? Should you try to, and leadership is really, it's performance and for appraisal and everything is maybe a bit much focused on extroversion. What do you do? Do you leave? Do you just jump into the uncomfortable zone and try to talk more, or what would you suggest?
Well, I guess I'll say two very different things. One is that when you evaluate your career or your particular company, excuse me, we really should be looking at questions of culture and personality fit just as intensely as you evaluate the salary or the position or anything else that you're looking at. Excuse me, because these aspects have a huge effect on your day-to-day happiness and ability to be successful. So, you know, if you were an introvert in a company that's incredibly like rah-rah and it's all about going out after work every night and you're not going to be happy with that, well, that's just a reality to notice and take into account. And the same is true for extroverts, because I hear from extroverts who work in companies that they find, you know, too muted, too scholarly, too much heads down, and they're not happy either. So these things matter. On the other hand, I would say, you know, bottom line, you want to be looking for work that you love. And in the service of work that you love, you can usually find your own way of doing the job, even if it's not the classical way. I gave the example of Douglas Conant, excuse me, the CEO who was writing all of those letters. You want to look for your own style, and you can be the world's most effective negotiator as an introvert. In my book, I profiled a guy who was a superstar salesman. He had the greatest sales record of his entire company, and he's a very introverted guy, but he took that maxim to heart that as a salesperson, you have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and you should use them in that proportion. And so he would really listen to his prospects and find out what did they need and work with them. So the draw on your own strength. It's 5 words to take with you. Draw on your own strength, those 5 words. And for almost any role, you will find there's a way of doing the role in which you're drawing on your own strength, even if it's not the classical way of performing that role.
So we have, I think, a couple of minutes left, and we have a question here that is personality the next big diversity issue? What do you think about that?
Yeah, I believe that it is one of the next big diversity issues. And I have seen this happening in companies over the last 8 years. Companies really bringing this into their vision of what diversity and inclusion means, and really working in a kind of proactive way to make this happen. And I'll tell you, you know, I actually started this work back from when I was a corporate lawyer, and I was always really interested in questions of management and professional development and things like this. So I was very interested in gender, and so I was always working on all the different working group committees for women at my law firm and so on. And I started to realize through that work that the questions that we had on the table, that the categories we had on the table of gender and so on, were great, but they didn't give the full picture. They didn't answer all the questions. You know, you'd see people showing up and behaving very differently at meetings and in negotiations and so on. And it wasn't all able to be explained through the lenses that we were using. And I started to realize, you know, really what the differences are here are that we have introverts and extroverts, and no one's talking about it. We don't have a vocabulary for it. And so companies now are starting to use this vocabulary and to understand its incredible power. And so I think we're only at the very beginning.
I think that's good. And I think that's a good note to end this Q&A on. We just about hitting 25 minutes. Time goes fast. I would like to thank you so much for taking the time to do this Q&A with us and the talk as well. And to everyone watching this, I suggest pick up the book if you haven't. It is great. You should take a look at the TED Talk, but I think you got a pretty good talk here as well. So
Well,
Other than
thank you.
that, I want to say, Susan, thank you so much for being part of this. And to everyone watching, I hope you got a lot of good insights out of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Lars, and thank you so much to everybody at HR Norway. It was really great to be here with all of you.